Welcome back. Welcome back to the 87th episode of the Korea podcast. I'm your host, Jack, located in Ulsan, South Korea. Very sunny and chilly place. Today is Monday, the 26th of October. And on today's podcast, I have a very special guest. Elizabeth Rice is with me, the author of, and I'm going to butcher the name. It's a long title. The South Korean Memoirs. So we finally managed to get together. We've been talking about doing this podcast for a while. I've been bugging Liz for a while, and she finally managed to scrounge up some time. Liz, welcome, and thanks a lot for coming in and joining us on the podcast here. Welcome.
Thanks, Jack. Great to be here.
Yeah, likewise. It's likewise to be here. It's always nice for me to be here. Liz is joining us from, I guess, sunny Costa Rica, right?
Well, usually, although it's a bit overcast this morning, which is fine because it's a little cooler.
Right. See, like in Ulsan here, at least, I don't know, in South Korea, I think overall the temperatures have been dropping drastically over the past few days. And today was really cold in Ulsan. I don't know what it's like in the capital, but it's usually a bit chillier, I think. But I've never been to Costa Rica myself. What's the climate like?
Well, it's worth a visit if you like tropical weather and animals and huge biodiversity here, so it's an amazing place to live.
Yeah.
And I live in a rural part of Costa Rica on a campus, a sustainable agriculture campus, so it offers a lot of outdoor space and monkeys and sloths and iguanas, and so it's a really great place to be.
Nice. That sounds like a blessing. I can hear birds chirping in the background, which is...
Yeah.
That's really awesome.
Yeah, it is.
That's one of the things I like whenever we happen to go out, and not this past year, but my family and I, are able to travel to Thailand. One of the first things that I notice when we leave the airports and kind of get out into the rural areas of Thailand, it's the massive amount of birds screeching and chirping early in the morning hours. You don't really get that in cities like Ulsan, in the metropolitan areas.
You don't.
Nice.
And here, sometimes we'll get like 50 parakeets all at once, and it's almost overwhelming how loud it is. But yeah, there's always birds around. It's great.
Nice. So, the reason why I wanted, to be honest with you, I don't even remember how I stumbled upon your book. It showed up somewhere in my feed. Sorry?
A post I was just thinking, Jack, if it was a post in the Korean Heritage Facebook page, perhaps.
Yeah.
But
it must be in one of the groups that we frequent. And whatever the topic was. But I thought it would be fantastic to talk to this person. Because you've got like two things going for you for this particular podcast. First, you're an author of a book that has a lot to do with Korea, your experiences in Korea, and I think a lot of what you will have to say about your experiences here might apply to a lot of the parents here, like myself, for example, who are raising children, who are either half non-Korean, half Korean. A lot of the parents that I've seen, may be considering at one point repatriating back to their, homelands. So I think a lot of your experience may come and kind of be very relevant to see firsthand what it's like for a child kind of leaving Korea and going back to the West, I guess. And then the second thing is you're a woman, and for some strange reason you're the third woman on the podcast. The first one was oh goodness, the second one was my wife. And then you're the third woman here, which is good. Because I've been looking for, for some reason, most of the people I keep in contact with are men. And I've asked some other girls to get up here and talk, but never heard back from them. So thank you for agreeing to come on and talk to me. So, um, you mentioned that you. So when is the last? Okay, how old were you when you moved to Korea? Maybe we can just start with that. How old were you when you moved to Korea?
So my parents moved to Korea in 1966 in
Mm.
September, and I was 9 months old. And I had three older brothers. So we were a family of six moving to Seoul.
Mm.
So I was 9 months old.
Tiny.
Yeah, baby.
And you lived here for 16 years, is that correct?
Yep, that's right.
Okay. Um, so maybe, I'm just trying to, honestly, I'm trying to dig up the. Okay, here you go. Rituals of Separation, a South Korean memoir.
It just
Um,
happened right here.
oh, fantastic. Yes. That is a very.
It's
The book cover, where was that taken?
uh, in the Hanok area in Seoul, in Pukchon.
Mm-hmm.
I took that picture from. Some people who've been there will remember there's an observatory, well, like a building where you can go to the fourth floor
Mm-hmm.
and get great views of that area. So I took that.
Nice. So this
Um,
is your picture.
yeah, it is.
Fantastic. Very nice.
Yeah.
What prompted you to write the book? Or maybe, could you maybe tell us just briefly what it's about? What is
Sure.
your book
Well, the
about?
full title is, which tells you a bit about what it's about, is Rituals of Separation, a South Korean memoir of identity and belonging.
Hmm.
So, going to Korea at 9 months in 1966, um, and then living there for 16 years, obviously Korea became a fundamental part of me, my story, my culture, my identity. So for me, moving back to the U.S. wasn't moving home. Um, it was going to a foreign country, essentially.
Right.
We would go back to the U.S. every 4 years or so, usually just for a summer. So that was the only contact I had with my relatives, with that country and that place. So because of that, and also because of how my parents chose to live in Korea, which I talk about a lot in the book, is a big part of my story. Um, I had a huge identity crisis and a huge, I would say, time of deep depression and anxiety in the U.S. really for probably a decade. Um, it didn't happen right away. Like everything's new and exciting at first, or it's different and hard, but you're in the throes of change when you go to a new country, whatever it is. But as I realized that that chapter of our life was supposed to somehow be over, and that it was a chapter, and it was really my childhood and who I was, I couldn't come to terms with that grief. It was a huge amount of grief and loss for so many things. So in my 30s, I worked. I was in the nonprofit sector. I got master's degree in public administration. I was doing things and living in the U.S. I spent some time in Zambia. I was working in immigrant refugee community in the U.S., which really helped me a lot. But I just did not feel like the U.S. was my country. And there's something that happens for people that look like they don't belong anywhere but the U.S. If you look at me, I don't look like I could pass American, no, but I
Right.
don't feel like one. And I had such an integral part of me felt Korean and influenced by Korea that it wasn't seen for who I was. So it's sort of a double-edged sword of you're away from your home and your people, and you're not really seen for who you are, even when you tell people who you are. So all of that prompted me in my 30s to say, I need to tell this story. So it was almost like the story was asking me to tell it. And not just the story of my identity and culture, but the story of Korea at that time. It's such an interesting place to have grown up. The story of my parents who were involved in the human rights and democracy movement, heavily involved in that, and actually wrote a book themselves with their colleagues about that time called More Than Witnesses. Um, but just the heavy influence of that time and place and country on me and friends like me. So it really was, I felt compelled by it. And actually, I wrote for 8 years, so it was a really long process. And I kind of discovered kind of the heart of the story as I went. You know, I kind of went back and forth with all these stories and what's the heart of it. You know, when you write a memoir or any story, you really want a center point. And the center point for me was kind of who am I, you know, and actually writing the book was a really great form of therapy for me as well. So that's how writing the book came about. And, you know, I wouldn't change anything. It was 8 hard years. Anyone who's written a book knows it's not easy. You know, in a memoir, you're kind of laying yourself out there, but it's really been rewarding. And the feedback from people who are similar to me, or people who love Korea, or people who, you know, it's been really rewarding to have people resonate with the story for many different reasons. And I think I like to make it universal because, you know, cultural identity is a very specific struggle, or I don't know the word for it, but it's a specific thing to deal with. But identity, loss, grief, culture, country, you know, all of those things, I think, are part of weigh on all of us in different ways. So, especially people who move around a lot or who move.
Right. Yeah, I think a lot of long-time expats begin with some kind of identity crisis at one point in time. But I think it affects people like yourself, because like you said, you know, you're not Korean, but you must have felt like as if you were Korean. So I guess my question would be, how were you in 1966 or 66 until, what's that, 16 years, like 20, 30?
82.
32, right?
82,
right, 82. Yeah, so moving backwards now.
That was the year my dad was born. But
How were you perceived by South Koreans? Like, how did people perceive you?
Well, you know, you have to remember that I didn't know anything other than the life that I grew up into. So, I had to think about that in writing the book. But, you know, Korea wasn't a heterogeneous place. You know, it was very homogeneous. So obviously, I wasn't ethnically Korean. That was so clear from the very beginning. There's no question. I never felt like I was an ethnic Korean. But there's a difference between feeling that and then feeling like, you know, like someone who's family's originally from China who feels American because they grew up in America. It's American, not in, you know, in ethnicity, but it's cut by country. So for me, growing up in Korea is I like to say, at my compass point. You know, that's my origin of place. That's how I came to know everything I know. That's the peninsula from which I began to see the world, and the culture, with my parents' culture. But they were very mired in Korean culture as well. But from that point, I began to see the world. So when I was little, you know, the first thing that happened is my parents went to Yonsei, to language school for 2 years, and my mom, who's quite a strong character, she passed away a couple of years ago, but she was a very strong person. And from the beginning, she said, my parents were Presbyterian missionaries, and usually Presbyterian missionary or missionary wives stayed at home. Some worked, some volunteered, but immediately my mom said, I'm going to language school too. So she was one of the first women to do that. So they went off to Yonsei language school. I was with caretakers during the day. So my first language was actually Korean. And then because my parents were very influenced by the civil rights movement in the U.S., they had already done a lot in terms of integrating. My dad went to seminary in Pittsburgh. They lived in a mixed race housing project. They were very social action oriented already. So when they moved to Korea against the advice of the kind of mission structure there, they said, we want to live in a Korean neighborhood. So when I for a couple of years we lived on the campus of Wegugan Hakyo, the Seoul Foreign School, and then Yonsei has some missionary houses. But as soon as they could, my parents, we moved to Pukayandong, so a neighborhood in Seoul, and just rented a house. So in that neighborhood, I went to Korean kindergarten.
Right.
And my brother Mark, when we arrived, was 4. They sent him to Korean kindergarten. So for both of us, and especially me just because I'm a little younger, but for both of us, we were very oriented in and very immersed in Korean society. My parents, spoke Korean very fluently within maybe 5 years. It's not an easy language as an adult to learn. But so they made Korean friends. We lived in a Korean neighborhood. Immediately they made choices that I know affected me. And I'm glad they did. Because for them, they said, we didn't move to Korea to live with Americans or Westerners. We moved to Korea to get to know Korean people.
Right.
Both started working at universities, so they got to know university students, and that's one way they started to know about the unrest and human rights situation that was going on there. So to go back to your question, I don't think in my Korean kindergarten class, I think I probably knew I was other. I was different, but I also wasn't. I was like, these are my friends. I'm in class with my friends. I spoke Korean fluently at that point, probably more than I ever did. So we lived in a Korean neighborhood. I think once I started to go to Seoul Foreign School, which I did in first grade, there was a bit of more of a removal from that day to day. I was in Seoul, and we stayed in a Korean neighborhood the whole time, like rented a house.
Yeah.
So you as a kid, I walk around, 미국 사람, and everybody was 미국 사람 if they weren't Korean. So to the chagrin of my German and English Canadian friends. But, so obviously, it wasn't like I was growing up thinking, oh, I'm ethnically Korean, but Korea was my country. Korea was my home. And again, it wasn't a global world at that point. My parents were one of the first to go to Korea that wasn't on a ship.
Right,
we flew.
Right.
So you got to think back to that time of the 50s, and Korean War had just ended, 13 years before that. It's a very different time. So in terms of kids now, and I think there's a lot of crossover issues with third culture kids, global nomad kids, in terms of identity and culture and all of that. I do think a difference is that we didn't have access to, other cultures really, others than through, say, our friends, our teachers, our expat community, and American Forces Korea Network, AFKN, which is what we call. I don't know if it's still on, but so I went to the U.S. every 4 to 5 years, so there wasn't this constant presence of the U.S. in my life. It was like the army bases and expats, but Korea was, I was basically growing up in that place without a lot of, feel. And I remember the first time coming to the U.S. I was 5. The first time I remember, I left when I was 9 months old, but I was 5 years old, and it was like, I still remember, oh my gosh, there's all this green grass and it smells different. And where are the people? And, it was so strange. And it was so foreign to me.
Right.
That's the interesting thing. And going back to Korea was always going home.
Right.
There was no question in my mind. So so that's, people ask that, we didn't think you were Korean. I'm like, well, you have to think about saying someone is Korean or American or Canadian or whatever. It's a big world now. It's a complex world. It's not just based on, who your grandparents were or your great grandparents were. It's, I would just say that's my home country, and that always was my home country. But I'm not, my story is my story. Every person who grew up in Korea has a different story to tell based on who they are, their family, what their family's political viewpoint, what their religious, views were, how they lived in Korea. We had, my parents had as many or more Korean friends than they had expat friends. So, it never was like one or the other. It wasn't like, oh, you're this and you're not that. My I think my parents are smart enough to know that we were who we were, and each one of my brothers, I have three older brothers, each one will tell you similar stories, but different stories, about their identity. Some things exactly the same as me. My 9-year-old brother, very different. He was 9 when we went to Korea, and it was a huge culture shock for him. 1966 Seoul, going from Connecticut to, 1966 Korea, as a 9-year-old, leaving a life that he loved and knew.
Right.
So, his story's really different. He cherishes Korea as well, but
in a different way.
Completely different.
Yeah.
Very different. Yeah.
Wow. It's interesting. Kind of what I was hoping to hear, and you did bring it up, is this, the response of the locals to you as a person of a different look from the majority, right? So it's not that different from how it was when I came here in 2005. Everybody.
Right. I would add, Jack, that what because I was home, and I spoke Korean and I knew Korean gestures, 안녕하세요. I knew how to. I was taught culture, Korean culture. Or I taught, or what is it? You acquired it like language. That the immediate barrier was there. Let's say a stranger in a store.
Yeah.
They looked at me, and I still feel the same way. They, immediately it's it's not a 한국 사람.
Yeah.
But then I say 안녕하세요, and I speak some Korean, and immediately it's a different feeling for me.
Right.
And so it never felt like a barrier. It was just it was part of living there. It was part of who I was and part of my story. Like, I never took offense. Where are you from? I was like, well, I knew what they were asking.
Yeah.
Saying parents are American. I'm American, and that was not offensive to me. I understand how it can be for people that live in some places, but for me, Korea was so homogeneous that the question was obviously, what's your story? It's got to me that's more like, what's your story? I don't think it's fair to ask someone that question. If they're Japanese American and they live in Seattle. No, I don't think that's fair. Because generations have lived there. But for someone like me as a kid, or my friends, it's just part of living in Korea.
Yeah.
So what's your story? It's more like, how'd you get here? You're not the typical person that walks in the story. But I felt so comfortable in Korea that I immediately could cross within a few seconds, could cut through that barrier.
Yeah.
It wasn't an issue. I just knew that was part of living there,
Yeah. I think that's some of the concerns that a lot of expat dads that I talk to have is, our kids being of kind of interracial marriage will have to deal with this kind of on a regular basis, on a consistent basis, that there will always be somebody who will point out that you're not really from here. So where are you from? Our kids who were born here, they are from here. They look different, but So.
Well, and that's a different story too. I mean, I grew up with kids or biracial kids or Korean kids who were adopted, and it's a lot, and they have some of the same issues as me because they grew up sort of maybe in a Western home, but I'm saying the adopted kids grew up in a Western home, but then they looked Korean and sometimes didn't speak Korean.
Right.
And that was a big shame, for them to go into a taxi and not be, just say a few.
To speak Korean, right?
Right. And so, and I think for example, like your kids and biracial kids, there are different issues for sure. Issues. And, my story in some ways is complicated, but it doesn't have that complication of like bicultural parents. That's a different dimension.
Yeah, true. I think with time, I don't know. I think this differentiation of, you look different. I think it's slowly going away. It's not going away as fast as I think many of us would like it to go away. But
Right. It has to be normalized in a way. It has to
yeah,
become
yeah,
not a different. It's not, it's part of Korea's story.
right. Yesterday, I was with my son. We were at a store, and this little boy. My son is 7, I guess, Western age, 8 Korean. We were in a store looking for fish, and this little boy, maybe 5-year-old kid, came up to my son and said, "Hyunga, 여기 보세요." And he says, like, "Big brother, come over." So he didn't even acknowledge the fact that my kid was different. He just,
Yeah.
right away said, "Hey, big brother, come here, look at these fish." So my son, decided that this kid was cool after he left. He's like, "Oh, Dad, he was good." I'm like, "Yeah, it was kind of cool." He didn't.
Yeah, I think, I think as a kid, you don't really want to be seen as other.
No.
I think in my circumstance, I had a huge community that sort of was in the same boat. And with my parents being who they were, and raising us how they did, I was okay with the form that took. You know?
Yeah. The one thing that that would kind of worry me about that right now is that, if I know that there are communities of expat dads who are married to like Korean women, and vice versa. I mean, there's a bunch of couples who on the other spectrum of the gender mix. Interacting with just that group of people kind of alienates, places people in a position of alienating themselves from the general public, from the native, which is also not healthy. Well, because that's not.
Yeah, I think you miss out on so much richness.
Right. Exactly.
I think that's maybe what I appreciated more than anything else about my parents' choices in Korea, other than that they chose to go. That they really chose to integrate themselves into Korean society and speak Korean.
That's important. I think a lot of expats kind of lack that now.
Yeah, I mean, I understand living here in Costa Rica, and now I can speak passable Spanish, but it's hard. And when you're an adult, and not necessarily working or not working in an environment that's like Korean or Spanish in this case, I understand it's not easy, but it makes a huge difference.
Sure.
My dad used to translate at Youngnak Church, so he got really fluent, and I think it made such a difference to our Korean friends and to Korean people. It just was like, it's a gesture too. It's saying, I value you enough, your country enough to learn your language. I'm not expecting you to know mine. I think I'm saying I understand why it's hard to not become fluent, or it's not easy to learn a language. But I do think it's worth it. I think it made a huge difference for my parents in their interactions and what they were able to do with the human rights and democracy movement and the trust that people put in them. It made a difference for me in my relationships, with the lady that worked in our home and her family, with my parents' friends. They're really gestures of in a way, thankfulness and respect for me to make that effort. I mean, my parents have a lot of funny stories and jokes about trying to learn Korean. And I think they made a tape recording at one point they were trying to learn how to say, "What time is it?" And then they played it back a year later, and neither one of them was even close. They were arguing about how to do it. So, I have a lot of admiration for them for making that effort. It's not easy.
No. Yeah. Somebody just recently asked me if I can tell the difference between the Seoul dialect and the what's the word? Saturi that's used here in the southern parts. And I can't. My Korean Korean is at a basic level, and I blame it on the curse of the English teacher. When you come here as an English teacher, like wherever you go, everyone expects you to do your job, and that's to teach English. You spend your 8 hours a day teaching English, or not necessarily 8 hours of teaching, but you're here at work. And when you try to make the effort to speak Korean, it's usually in the work environment, which doesn't really allow for it. And then when you leave, after 8 hours of work, oftentimes your brain is so fried, you don't really want to make the effort anymore. So,
it's not easy. Sure.
So you're stuck. It's really difficult. You really have to make an effort, to go out of your way and learn. And when I was a single man in my first 2 years, I did make the effort. I did pick up books, and I was picking stuff up. But then my workload picked up, and my Korean vocabulary, started to take a hit, so to speak. And then I got married, and when I met my wife, she didn't speak any English, minimal. So, and my Korean was, virtually non-existent. I may have known hello and goodbye. But so we basically got to know each other over bottles of one form or another of alcohol, dinners, and, her speaking Korean and me speaking in English, and lots of dancing and, hand gestures. But over time, she learned English to a high-level proficiency, and my Korean remained that at the level of a 3 or 5-year-old, I guess. I can communicate with a 5-year-old right now.
That's important.
So
well, and to be fair, my parents had two concentrated paid-for years at Yonsei, which was the best, place school, probably one of the best in the world at that point. So, they had 2 years of dedicated. That was their assignment at the beginning, was to
right.
learn.
That's what I need.
So.
I have another friend who also came here, and he came with a purpose. His goal of learning Korean was to be able to read a Korean newspaper. And he spent a year going to the Busan National University. I don't remember which one. But, he achieved a very high level of fluency in Korean. Right now he works as a translator, kind of freelance translator, Korean to English. Or
Impressive.
English to Korean. I don't know. It only works one way. It's easier one than the other.
Yeah.
But
interesting.
So what I wanted to ask you about is, and I think maybe many dads or parents of children who were born here in South Korea would be interested to know, is what was your experience? So, what was your experience of returning back to the States like?
So I talked about that a little bit, but we left in '82. I was a senior. I was going to be a senior in high school. So we left. My dad was kind of ready to go to the U.S. My mom wanted to stay. I think she would have just retired in Korea. But also my 3 brothers were not living in Korea anymore. So I think they felt like with me about to graduate, it would have been hard for them to be away.
Right.
So they came to the decision. My dad got a job as a chaplain at a hospital. And when I was in the U.S. for 1 year in 8th grade. We took a year furlough. My mom started a master's in social work. She's a social worker.
Okay.
So I had that 1 year experience, which was really, really hard. In 8th grade, moving from Seoul Foreign School with 30 different countries, and moving to Norman, Oklahoma. At a huge middle school, maybe 300 kids. Right. It ended up, being okay by the end. I made friends. That's the factor. Can you find people that understand you or know, you can have relationships with? By the end, I had friends, but say the first few months, I didn't even want to go to school. Right. I would pretend that I was sick. It was terrible. Kids made fun of me, where are you from? And I wasn't even saying where, that I would live in Korea. They just knew I was different. They could see it. They could smell it. 8th graders can smell that kind of fear. So, but by the end of the year, I had made friends. So when we went back, when we went to the U.S., my parents decided to go to Oklahoma again. My parents, by the way, are from Niagara Falls, New York. So they grew up in that area. So when we went to Oklahoma, it was a very out of the blue kind of thing, but it was University of Oklahoma had a social work program my mom wanted to go to. Uh, so, um, so then going back senior year, at least I had friends from 8th grade. So that year was okay. It was my parents, we were involved with, my mom was doing work with, actually with Vietnamese refugees who were settling in Oklahoma City, and also with wives of U.S. military men, who Korean wives of U.S. military men who had come back and who had come to the U.S. with their husbands, but were having a really hard time. There was a base in Oklahoma. I can't think of the name of it right now, but she did counseling and support for those immigrants and refugees and wives of U.S. military. So we had a lot of my parents' kind of diversity around us. I had a friendship group that I had created in 8th grade. So that year was okay. And I had my parents. I mean, they were the link to Korea, to our life together. Mm-hmm. As soon as I went to college, I sort of fell apart. I went to Middlebury College. It's a small liberal arts college in Vermont, where we have a long family history. But it's a great school. It's just at that time, especially, it was a very elite kind of New England elite prep school. Kids went there. I was a fish out of water completely. Hardly any diversity at all. I can't remember if there were any Asian students. I don't think there were any Asian students in my class. So again, I was like, that we had something called Facebook. Actually, was our a paper book of freshman faces and where you're from. Elizabeth Rice, Oklahoma City. I had lived there early year. So where I was in this like very white, wealthy, privileged environment, with almost my background kind of erased in a way.
Right.
There was no context to talk about it, and it definitely was no context to talk about. It was like, oh, Korea. Is that?
I guess I could imagine back then, Korea was a very people didn't know anything about Korea back then. Right now, at least, it's made its footprint.
Oh, yeah, totally different now. You know what happens now? I live on a campus with students from all over the world. Almost every student. Oh, you lived in Korea. I love Korea. I love the music. I love the movies.
Right.
No, I mean, when I was, in college, Korea was, people knew about MASH, the show. They knew about the Korean War. I would say that's about it.
Right.
And they knew about the Korean War from an American perspective.
Right.
So that's what, and then they confuse it with the Vietnam War, say like, did you grow up in South or North Korea? I'm like, well, South, but anyway,
right.
And then it also just sounds, anybody who's an expat knows when you are not in the country where you were living, where you were an expat, and you start talking about that country, some people either aren't that interested, which is fine, or it sounds like bragging, or I don't know. It was weird. It was almost like, it's like, oh, from. It was just out of context. It was like, where are you from? Oh, California. Oh, Connecticut. Oh, well, I grew up in Korea. It's like, some, places that's a conversation starter, but some it's a stopper. It's like, oh, like, where do we go from there?
Right.
Because it's not easy to say like, oh, or like, what was that like? Or, oh, really? Or why? Or, people weren't that curious. I wouldn't say that's true for my whole life, but at that place, at that time. So I sort of put it behind me. It was like, okay, that's not part of me. I'm Liz, and I'm at Middlebury College. But I spiraled into a deep depression. I was kind of lost. I didn't, and I couldn't quite figure out why. During the summer of my junior year, I went to Yonsei for their international program. And within like 2 weeks, my depression just was gone. It was like, I'm home. I'm back. I was studying. I actually went to the program where you study Korean culture, Korean art. It was a great summer. I lived at Yonsei campus. Was basically like my backyard when I was growing up. So I was home. It was immediate, and I just was who I'm me again. I don't have to answer. I don't. It's actually much less complicated for me being me there than it was at Middlebury College. At Middlebury
Right.
College, I was completely lost. So that kind of began the identity culture crisis. And remember that my parents, they grew up in Niagara Falls, New York.
Hmm.
We didn't go there when we came back. We went to Oklahoma.
Hmm.
Then I went to Vermont for college. I had no U.S. home.
Hmm.
I had no hometown.
Right.
So I just began a process of trying to reinvent myself in all these different places I lived in. I did some interesting work that I'm glad I did, but Mississippi, North Carolina, I lived in Vermont, I lived in Boston, I lived in Seattle, I lived in Minneapolis. I kept trying to find home and trying to find a home. And I realized, at some point, and I think what happened was I just needed to go home. And sometimes it irritates me when people say you can't go home again, because I don't think that's true. I know what they're trying to say, but I think sometimes you have to go home again, and a lot of us do.
Hmm.
It's like, I need to go visit, Winnipeg, where you're from. I need to
Yeah.
visit, Seoul. I need to visit. People do it because they need it. They need a refresher. They need a reminder. And
Sure.
say, oh, you can't go home again. And so finally, after 10 years away, I thought I was going to die. It was like Korea. It was almost like that had never happened. That whole
Hmm.
full, rich, huge, rich life, hundreds of people that we knew, the community, the mountains, the trees, everything about Korea. It was almost like imaginary.
Hmm.
Like it didn't really happen, but it was such a part of me. So I just said to myself, this is silly. I need to go. And for me, that was the beginning of a healing process. It was the beginning of kind of uncovering what had happened, dealing with the grief and the loss of that place in my life, coming to terms with who I was, and that it was okay to be exactly who I was. It doesn't even need definition. It's just what it is.
Right.
I'm American by passport. I'm Korean by heart. Korea's my home. I feel much more comfortable internationally than I do in the U.S. It's just part of my story. There's nothing against the U.S. It's just where I feel centered,
Hmm.
away from that. And I think, for me, Costa Rica in a way there's some, it's pretty developed in some places, but there's some, development that feels more like Korea at that time. And also it's really familial. And also it's a small country. I'm so comfortable in small country. I don't know what to do with the U.S. It's huge. I don't even know where to begin. And I moved around a lot, but it was like overwhelming. I couldn't grasp on to like, what's the culture? How do I, Korea was so easy for me. I understood it. And it's not to say it's not complex, and I get it all, but I just fundamentally, there was something I could grasp onto.
Hmm.
And that's how I feel in Costa Rica as well. There's a culture here. There's a way of being. And so that was a really hard time for me. I wouldn't have written this book had I come back and, integrated successfully
Right.
into the U.S. It just didn't happen for me. It does happen for a lot of people. So the people who are parents of global nomad kids or third culture kids, it's not, my story isn't everyone's story, but there's probably, pieces of it that different kids will carry in different ways, depending on who they are and how they identify and
Yeah.
their person.
I could see my daughter falling into a category similar to yourself. She's very much at home in Korea. I think not. She's very independent, but when it comes to like international or internationalization, I could see her having a really hard time leaving Korea behind. I can see my son a little bit being a little bit more at home with living abroad. But for my daughter, it's rice and kimchi, breakfast, lunch, and dinner if she's allowed to. My son enjoys pizza, and like I can see by their interactions in the language and with other people and the way they talk about where they're from, that my daughter would be the one wanting to go home after a month or 2 months visit to Canada. She'd probably be like, she says now I want to go to Winnipeg. I want to see Babcha, my mother. I want to see snow in Winnipeg. But I think that's like the only attraction, because they've never really experienced snow in Korea here so much. So once they visited Winnipeg for a winter, they'd be running away as quickly as they could. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that each child is really different, and I think what was hard for me was that my parents, left Korea. I think if they had remained, and I'm not saying that they should have, but I wish they had, in a way, because it was, if they had been there, which, one of my best friends is Kathy, and she lives in Maine, but her parents, same story. Her parents were Methodist missionaries. She grew up very well. Her parents stayed for a while. So for her, going home on vacation, longer vacations, was going to Seoul, and so there's this continuity.
Yeah.
It's like you lose your home, you lose your family. For me, it was like, wait a minute. It was like it dawned on me 2 years later. After, like, oh my gosh, like we're not going back. Like that's just over. Like that's my life. Like, what do you mean we're not? And I knew it. It's like, of course I knew it, but it didn't hit me till a couple of years later.
I guess it's the idea of like completely losing touch with something that you knew was your home. Like you said, if in the back of your mind, like if you move somewhere, and you know that there is a chance of you being able to go back to where you came from, then you're kind of fearless. But if that lifeline is kind of severed, then I don't know. I think it builds a kind of a fear in a person of, wow, this is finally it. This is it. Like there's no way back, no turning back, type of deal.
Right, and I always say I could go back, and I did it when I went in college, and then actually I was away for 10 years. That was the really grief I went through. As soon as I started going back every 2 to 3 years, and I go back every 2 years now because I just need to go home, and I feel super comfortable there still. It doesn't matter all the changes and everything; it's still home. So I've made Korea my life, part of my life now too. Yeah. We still have relationships with people. So that for me was like, I can't count on my parents anymore. My family being the connection, not that they were, but as an adult, I was like, oh, so for me to go back, I don't have a Korean passport, so I have to go like do something. I can't just go out, just like go and live there.
Right.
But I think it was like, I realized I have to take it upon myself to go. I just need to go, and I don't need to figure it out. I need to go. I can just go visit for a month or two,
Right.
Or go, like I went for the summer.
When's the last time you came to visit?
April of it's about a year and a half.
Wow. Okay. Not that long ago.
The lady that worked in our home, she's still alive. She's 90, and her family are really like our family. So, she's very dear to me. She's another mom to me. We're always close. She didn't come into our life until I was 6, but we're always really close, and she's a great part of our family story there. She really was there through a lot of our ups and downs, and she lost her husband in the war. I mean, I'm sorry, not in the war, but she met her husband during the war, but she lost him when she was in her 30s with 3 young children, and he was he was sick, and he died, and so he actually taught at the kindergarten where my brother had gone. He worked at the kindergarten as a driver where my brother had gone at EYU Tijuana. So someone said there's a lady whose husband has passed away, and she wants to keep her children, and she's desperate. So my parents hired her to work in our home. So that's how she came to us. So really, she came to us in a great loss. But our families really became intertwined, and one of my chapters in my book is about finding her again, because when we left Korea in '82, very tearful goodbye with her family. When I came back in '86, we had lost contact. They had moved. And, finding someone in Seoul isn't always easy. Yeah. But I went with our help of a Korean friend, I went to the Yeonhee-dong neighborhood office, and I found out where she had moved. So I literally walked up to her apartment door and knocked on it, and and said, "Hagwon, Lizzie," and it's just a tearful, wonderful reunion. So since that day, they visited the U.S. about 10 years ago. My parents' house in Vermont. My brother Chris, actually, he and his wife, until recently, they live in New York now, but he was in Chuncheon for 5 years. A year ago, he came back working with Central Committee. So he was able to have a regular relationship with them, and I talk with them off and on. And that's one of my main reasons for going back, is seeing her and her family. So it's really, I still have family there. It's how it feels.
Yeah.
It's not like part of my past. Korea doesn't feel like part of my past.
Right.
It's an important part of my childhood. It's an important part of who I am now.
What are some of the major differences that you would, some of the major differences in Korea and how it's changed over time, since 1988 or 3 when you left, and I guess the last time you visited?
Wow.
I know there's got to be so many, but if you could think some of the more prominent ones.
We were skating on rice paddies in Yeonnam. So, well, in 88, let's say in 83 when we left, or I would say 86 is the last time I was there for an extended period. It was beginning to develop. Olympics were about to start to happen. You're starting to see, some change of not as homogeneous. People dyeing their hair, some different things. But that was so strange to me. Like, that there was differences tolerated, even small. It's funny, Jack, because I feel like it's like I can't even begin to talk about the changes in technology and the changes in development. Where do you even begin in terms of Gangnam was like open rice paddies, and we used to go to folk village, was like way out in the countryside. I remember waiting for the bus in front. It was like there's nothing for miles here. So you can't even kind of begin to. I remember like them building some of the bridges that they were building across the Han River. But on the other hand, Korea was always just like this bustling, dynamic place, and that's to me that what remains. So I feel like there's, I feel like the language has changed for sure. I can speak much better with older people than younger people, Korean people. I feel like, with democracy is maybe brought more equality, though I know a lot of inequalities still exist. I don't know. It's funny. It's like you could write a book about how much Korea has changed, but then on the other hand, like I'm saying, I feel like a lot feels still very Korean to me when I go.
Right.
I still feel like the core of culture, a way of relating, the hustle and bustle, especially of Seoul and cities and markets, and I just, I don't know. I feel like it's both. It's completely different and exactly the same at the same time. I don't know how to explain that.
Yeah, no, I kind of get it. I think the overall essence of a place remains, but just the aesthetic look of it kind of changes in some ways, right?
Yeah, I mean, like when I'm sitting down with my Korean family, having a meal and we're sharing stories. I could have been, it can be 30 years ago. It's that feeling.
Yeah.
The relationship we have, the way we're speaking, what we're eating, the way we're eating. There's just the essence to it that for me hasn't changed. But of course, all around that has changed a lot.
Right.
And I know for Korean people, life has changed tremendously. Apartment living.
There's a quick little question here. The J-Vlog, who's a vlogger based out of Japan, we sometimes frequent each other's podcasts. He asks, are there any major differences you noticed in children's games activities? I guess the question was directed, I guess, maybe when you moved back were there different ways in which kids played back in the States versus the way kids played in Korea?
I'm thinking about young kids. I would say not really. I mean, I think at that time I was a young kid.
Hmm.
It was a very U.S. and in Korea would say were very outdoor kind of oriented kid places.
Right.
You went to the yard and there's no tablets, no
Yeah, I think the entire
nothing.
world's changed these days. All kids are stuck indoors with their phones and devices.
Yeah, I mean, we just went outside and played. I can tell you what we did. It was like soccer and basketball or we were whatever it was. I think for me, maybe that would be really different. I don't know. Maybe it's the same now because it's technology, but I don't remember feeling a big difference in that.
Right. I'm having a hard time getting my kids to play board games these days. I ordered a whole box of board games yesterday. Half of them I've never seen these board games, so I have to learn, myself how to play. And I pulled out a few over the weekend. I was sitting, poring over the instructions, trying to figure it out, and my kids rolling on the ground, going, "I'm bored. Can we play with my phone?" I'm going, "Oh my goodness."
Different thing.
Very different.
Yeah. I mean, definitely for sure Korea, in the U.S. there was more access to like that board games. I remember playing Candyland when I was in kindergarten and being so excited, and Monopoly. Like we had board games growing up because my parents brought some with us, so we sort of grew up with that.
Right.
So that might have been an aspect of my identity that was much more. I was influenced by my parents, kind of. I knew what Monopoly was and all those board games that we played. But we played a lot of, Korean outdoor games as well.
So, Liz, is there any chance that you could read a short excerpt for us? You mentioned that you had something in mind. I'm just wondering if you could whip out your production and maybe entice us with a little reading.
Yeah.
Introductory reading to the book, and
Yeah. I mean, I was going to read the beginning. I feel like I've talked a lot about that, but maybe it still makes sense to do that. Just to explain a little bit. The book's the center of the book. The story is about culture and identity through my story, my parents, and my story of going to Korea. But it gets a lot into also my parents' work. My mom was as a social worker with House of Grace, it was called at the time, 8-on-1 with single mothers, and then their work, unofficial work with the Human Rights and Democracy movement. So that takes up a big portion of the book. Just so it's. But that's that's part of the identity story too. That's right. What my parents were doing. I guess I'll just stick with reading the beginning. I mean, maybe it's more to get a feel for the book.
Yeah, that sounds good.
I think starting with the story in the middle is random. Yeah. So I'll start with the quote. This is my first birthday.
All right, nice.
So the quote is attributed to Chief Poundmaker, a Native American, but the first chapter is called "Sitting by the Trail." The quote I start with is, "We all know the story about the man who sat by the trail too long, and then it grew over, and he could never find his way again. We can never forget what has happened, but we cannot go back, nor can we just sit beside the trail." So I start also with a letter from our Ajamoni's daughter, and I'm in the U.S. at this point. "Hi, Lizzie, how are you? This morning we saw a new building in Yeonidong, and we were so surprised because it is located instead of your child house. Our funny house on the hill is gone. Persimmon tree, fired green garden, and mom's kitchen, all gone. Time flies fast. Tell mom and dad. We think and talk about you all the time. Send news again. Bye, Youngju. My childhood house is gone. It was bulldozed and replaced with a nondescript apartment building. 2 of our other Seoul homes will fall to the wrecking ball this year. This is the way of life when you come from a city that changes so fast. People say it has liquid architecture. Sometimes it feels like I had a liquid childhood. So how did it feel so steadfast and rooted, so unwavering? I feel a lump settle in my throat as I read Youngju's email. I picture the warm floor of my parents' bedroom. I remember the comfort of slipping under mom's thick Eagle blanket after school. The way the fabric of the rainbow-colored silk of the Yo mattress moved easily against the rice paper-covered surface. I see the long view of western Seoul from our yard above the valley road and the tangle of one-story homes and businesses that stretched out for miles into the horizon. As if it was just yesterday, I see the single persimmon tree outside the living room window and the two tall ginkgos that stood like sentinels guarding our Nissan station wagon. And now it's all gone. What did they do with the ginkgo trees when they took down our house? Is the persimmon tree that gave us such soft orange fruit year after year now in a heap of concrete and dust somewhere outside the city? Is the thick rice paper of our floors crumpled there too? And where is Ajimoni today? But there is too much loss in this image, too much heartbreak. I don't want to dwell on what is gone, but sometimes it seems to be all I can do. Maybe I carry some measure of Han, the collective ache and unresolved resentment Koreans are said to carry from enduring centuries of hardship. Or maybe I'm just longing to go home, to talk to Ajimoni, to pluck a persimmon from our tree. Youngju's mother was in her 30s when she came to work for us. Recently widowed, she desperately needed employment so she could keep her 3 young children. One day, Ajimoni told me the story of her husband's death. She used her shirt sleeves to wipe away falling tears, as if in wiping them away she could reverse his death. Maum is the Korean word for heart, but the word, like so much about Korea, is untranslatable into English. Maum is the deepest place of the soul, part mind, part spirit center. Maomi apayo, Ajimoni said as she patted her hand to her chest. My heart hurts. She didn't hide her sorrow from me in the same way she didn't suppress her infectious laughter when it came. By the age of 6, when she came into my life, I had lived 5 of my 6 years in South Korea. I was accustomed to her open lament and easy amusement. I was familiar with her way of expressing pain and loss, and I knew it was different from the way my grandparents expressed theirs. They kept their sorrows private. Their conflicts were hidden behind closed doors. I held and balanced each way inside of me. I was a little American girl with a Korean heart, at home in a country of open tears. I never imagined that years would pass when I wouldn't say Ajimoni. I never imagined a day would come I wouldn't walk the hillsides of Yeonidong or past the centuries-old city gates that define the limits of my universe. For 16 years, the air of Korea filled my lungs, and the ways of that land settled into my heart. When my family left Korea, I carried my love for Ajimoni with me. I carried the morning mist that materialized in the pine forests of Saddleback Mountain and the chatter of the blue and white gachi, the magpie who called to me each morning from the tree outside my bedroom window. I carried the expat community who helped raise me, aunts, uncles, cousins by circumstance, so-called foreigners who called Korea home. I carried my international school friends, the only people in the world who shared my particular identity. I carried the story of my parents, humble people of humor and great life spirit, who not only chose to leave behind lives of privilege, but ended up walking arm in arm with Koreans fighting for human rights and democracy. People who answered a calling to be missionaries and then challenged the idea of what being a missionary was all about. I carried the story of 8 men hung for no reason, and the tragedy of one country split in 2. In my 20s, I began to dream about Korea. I walked through open markets of knockoff Nikes, nylon backpacks, and stacks of dried fish. Men pulled carts of Napa cabbages and thick taffy along city roads. Middle-aged ladies in starched yellow uniforms pedaled yogurt carts through my old neighborhood like carry-on luggage. The night was beginning to feel more real than the day. I was 5 again, skipping past mounds of spent yantan charcoal briquettes. Our house appeared around the corner as if my family never left Korea. Mom was there, and Ajimoni too, laughing as she added sesame oil to a simmering stew. I was carrying my longing for Korea like a chige A-frame of heavy stones. Instead of stacks of firewood, I carried a childhood. Each stone was a memory I couldn't put down. Maomi, apayo. I began to count up the years I had lived in the U.S. and measure them against the number of years I had lived in Korea. I felt reassured when I calculated the greater balance was spent in Korea, but the balance was shifting. Could I keep or lose the Korean part of me through simple mathematics? Could the most fundamental part of me slip away over time? Was all of me still there if a part of me was hidden behind light hair, green blue eyes, and native English ability? I knew identity wasn't like this. I knew that deep inside of me was a person, anchored and fixed, formed by family, genetics, learned rituals, and environment. I also knew that when people looked at me, they saw the obvious, because this is what we all do. We categorize others by their appearance to make sense of the world. We categorize others to make sense of ourselves. Where are you from? People ask again and again. I'm a migoksadam in Korea, an American. In Costa Rica, I've learned to say soy gringa. When I lived in Zambia, I was a muzungu, the general term used for a white person, which literally means, maybe too fittingly in my case, someone who roams around aimlessly. But I carry a person inside of me. My outside doesn't tell my full story of longing. My face and passport only tell part of my internal truth. They represent the story.
Nice. There's a lot of information in there.
Yeah, I mean, it's really setting the setting, setting
Yeah.
the tone.
It's interesting how you point out the difference in how people express their sorrow in Korea and how your grandparents expressed their sorrow. I just had a discussion with my friend about that, and I know there are Korean expressions for that which I do not remember what they are. But the way I always see Korea is there's like this inherent sense of sorrow, like a national kind of sorrow, and it's visible in the music, and it's visible in the pop culture and like in television, and it's always there.
Yeah.
Unavoidable.
Well, yeah, and growing up as a kid when I did, 1966, like I said, it really wasn't that long. If you think about what devastation the Korean War brought and
Yes.
poverty.
Yeah, right.
It was the poorest country in the world at that point. So that was just a visible part of everyday life,
Mm-hmm.
So that stays with you. If you're a sensitive person, that stays with you,
Mm-hmm.
that story. And I think that's as much what the book is about.
Yeah.
Is that Korea's story really stayed with me. I really grew up learning about the Korean War, the devastation of that, Korea kind of as a pawn between different countries. And I was very nationalistic, actually,
Mm-hmm.
about, and I, even though my parents were American, they weren't necessarily that pro-military. So I didn't grow up with a great feeling of the U.S. presence there. I just didn't have that.
Right.
I didn't have a good, and my contact, with the U.S. was Itaewon. It wasn't a great representation at that time of, U.S. influence on a place. So that really, I'm sure it has something to do with how I felt about the U.S. when I went to live there. But yeah, I think that those stories, Ajimoni's story and the people that we knew, they all had a backstory that was very, very painful.
Mm-hmm.
So we knew some of them, we didn't know all of them, but
Yeah.
that certainly stayed with me, and I certainly carry it still,
Just 2 weeks ago, I think it was 2 weeks ago, I had a podcast that was just kind of a brief look at the modern history of South Korea, and I found this article, I read it, and it just looked basically at what Korea went through post the Korean War, and it was a very summarized version of it. But one of my Korean students kind of listened to it and said, wow, that was a very good objective summary, probably based on like some non-Korean, non-leftist or rightist kind of perspective, but a very objective point of view. And, while I was reading it myself, it kind of dawned on me that a lot of the people that we interact with, like my dad's age, or even my wife's age, they came from the time where Korea was just recovering. It's not that long ago. I mean, it's 20. So, my wife was born in 1977, which, she was a teenager during the 80s. Okay, a little bit later than that, but but it was still a time a time, of kind of growth, like very early time of growth for her. And so anybody who's older than her, her uncles, her parents have gone through all that. So,
That's right.
a lot of expats come to Korea, and I think a lot of us fail to understand that we're dealing with people who have gone through a lot, and they sacrificed a lot for the nation. And a lot of us, I think, get upset over terms like urinara, or it's always our country this, our country that, and there's this animosity towards other nations like Japan and da. And a lot of expats don't really understand that. We kind of look at it dismissively, saying, why don't you just get over it? But like I said, you're dealing with a population that basically grew out of, this kind of environment, and it's kind of hard for them, or impossible for them, to just dismiss it like it never happened, right? So
well, those things get carried through generations as well. And I would say one thing I talked about in my book is that generation, that the generations that went through the hardest time in Korea, I would say there was no big group therapy to process what had happened. It was like, get on with it. There were mouths to feed. And so all that trauma, all that loss, all that devastation, I mean, just horrible, it gets carried. It gets carried on. I think what's interesting, the reason I named my book is Rituals of Separation. There's a Korean artist whose name is Minok Lim. And I became interested in her. I was writing the book because her art she does do her art as a reflection of loss, of all that's changed in Korea so quickly. Like, you have people who grew up with, coal, like charcoal yonton stoves, who now are living like in apartment buildings in Seoul with high technology. Like in one generation, some people went through that. So her art actually addresses that loss. And so the reason I named my book that was just to honor her, in terms of her exploring that in terms of Korean identity, of what do you do with a generation that has gone through that much change and that much loss of community in a way. I would say that maybe that's the thing of Korea that I would have to say more. I've heard from Korean friends, because I haven't lived there as recently, but that maybe a loss of community connection, that kind of thing, that older Korea may have had more to. But what she wrote was, Nietzsche was said to have wept as he embraced a downtrodden horse, but I want to weep embracing places. I am weeping, hugging a place as the protagonist of a tragedy. I am inventing rituals for and keeping records of moments of separation. So for me, the book was this idea of, we all have grief and loss in our life. Being human is part of that, whether it's leaving a home or losing family or losing a parent or a child or whatever it is. But if you don't grieve that loss, if you don't have some ritual of separation, something that helps you recognize it and process it, you can carry it. So people carry grief. They carry loss, and that's when it becomes destructive. We all have grief and loss. That's not the problem. It's when you can't let go of it. Right. So for me, this was kind of this writing the book and telling the story was a ritual of separation for me. Not that it separates me from the story, but it's a way to say, this is what happened. I acknowledge it. This is my story. And, so that's where the title comes from.
Right.
And that's really what the book is.
How do people get a hold of your book then? I posted a link to your Facebook page for the Ritual of Separation, a South Korean memoir.
So it's on Amazon.
Okay, just type in the title and it will pop up.
Yeah, Elizabeth Rice. It should, Rituals of Separation, Elizabeth Rice. It should come up, and there's a Kindle version as well.
There's a Kindle version as well, yeah. Right.
Yep.
Okay.
So, yeah.
So yeah, if you're here to the podcast, if you're new or a stable visitor, and you would like to check out Elizabeth's book, then head over to Amazon. You get two different kinds: digital, the modern kind, or the good old paper type bound.
Yep. And I would say, Jack, at some point I would really be interested in having it translated. I haven't put a lot of energy into that, but I would love it have Korean. So if anybody out there has good context for that or an idea for that,
translation.
I always try to put that out there. Yeah, just to get it translated into Korean.
Yeah. Okay. I may have have some contacts in that area, so I can send out a message or two to a friend and see.
Great.
All right. Liz, what are your plans for like your upcoming future in terms of, I don't know, where you are, where you're going?
Right now, I am doing some writing as a consultant at the university where I live. I do a lot of interviews with incoming students and write stories about them and that type of thing. So I'm not outside of that. I'm not working other than writing, and I'd like to write another book. There's nothing speaking to me yet. I have some ideas, mostly related to Korea. I think one thing is, and maybe this has been done, but I don't think it's been done in English, is I really want to explore some stories of Hagwonese. I think Korea is losing, a lot with their older people now. I'd love to write a book of maybe like 10 stories of just profiles. And the other idea I've had is searching for old Korea, like doing a 6-month trip to Korea, to go like to the most rural, untouched places I can find, and
they're disappearing quickly, I think.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. That's why.
Yeah.
But really interested in that. I'm very interested in the past. I think not just with Korea, but in general. So I think it's so powerful, those stories and those people that carry that history, that their stories are told. So hopefully some writing. I've worked in the NGO sector for about 15 years. I think about getting back to that right now. It's not really in the cards right now where I am, but we'll see. I might do some of that work here as well.
Right. Okay, sounds great.
Yeah, and Korea as soon as I can.
Yeah.
For a visit.
Not. Yeah. Everybody's doing a 2-week quarantine.
Yeah.
Thingy
Go now. Wait till this is over.
Any last words of wisdom for living and experiencing South Korea?
Gosh, I would just say, really appreciate the things that it has to offer. I think it's a special, maybe I'm biased, I think it's a special place with special people. Once you get to underneath the surface, I think the surface is really fun too. But I guess just, really get to know the history, and not assuming people haven't, but for those who haven't, really understand the history and understand the place. I think it's a great. I wouldn't trade it for any other place to have grown up at the time I did, given all struggles and everything that has gone through. Just the deepness of relationships we had. Just the place itself has so much in terms of its story, that I think that's still part of it. So.
All right. Great. Liz, we've been up for longer than usual, so that's
okay.
Good.
Okay.
Thank you very much for your time, Liz. It was really nice talking to you. Really great stories.
Thanks so much for getting in touch with me. I really appreciate it.
No problemo. Hope to talk to you soon sometime, maybe.
Yep. Sounds good.
All right. Take care.
Okay. Take care.
Bye. All right. Well, that was Liz, Elizabeth Rice. If you are interested in reading the book, you can follow the link. I posted a link to the Facebook page, and you can have a look at the book before you march on to Amazon. But the book is available on Amazon in 2 versions, Kindle and hard copy. So check it out. I might pick it up myself because it sounds interesting. Yes. Okay. Well, we're gonna make the ending short, I guess, because it's already 11:20 on the 26th. So remember, if you have been with us at JVlog, thanks for swinging by and asking all the questions. Sorry that I took so long. I didn't want to interrupt Liz because she was sharing her book, which was very interesting. So thanks for stopping by, JVlog. Anybody else who's watching the podcast now live or after the fact, after recording, if you enjoyed it, then make sure to like us, subscribe to the channel. A video is coming up on fishing, ocean fishing in South Korea. It's edited, it's ready to be published. It's going to be up on Wednesday, and I guess maybe this week I'll be able to publish 2 videos because I've got one already done. So if you're new here, if you're like us living in Korea or simply enjoy watching content about Korea, its culture, food and people, then make sure to come back. And for the remainder of the crowd, for all the people who are here, enjoy the rest of your week. Halloween's coming up. Happy Halloween, and have a good and scary one, and all that stuff. Bye bye. Have a good night.